at this point. We really need all of these options, because if we exclude one option, and specifically if we exclude CCS, the ability to actually reduce or mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, exponentially the costs increase. So we really need to attack this on all fronts. And the administration in the United States has really said this is an all-above strategy, and we really need to look at all opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. One of the next slides that I have here is we'll talk about the regulations in terms of the underground injection control, but also on the power plant side. There's a number of regulations that have been coming down that the utility industry needs to address. Specifically, the third one down is the greenhouse gas emissions for new source performance standards and existing greenhouse gas regulations that have been proposed. Those regulations specifically reference CCS as an opportunity. They may not be necessary depending on the amount of emissions that are allowed from these sources, but it's definitely a technology option that needs to be considered when you're looking at new plants or retrofitting existing plants to meet the standards. So what fossil energy program consists of, primarily we're focused on developing technologies for capturing CO2 from coal-fired facilities. That includes pulverized coal facilities, so actually either retrofitting or putting a post-combustion capture system on a power plant after you've combusted the coal, generated electricity, and scrubbed other contaminants from the flue gas. This is just before the stack. You put the capture system on. In the gasification system, it's a little bit more integrated with the gasification process, where we can separate CO2. Typically, it's done with Selexol, but we're looking at advanced or Rectisol. We're looking at advanced technologies now for gasification, or looking at other types of generation platforms like oxy-combustion, MHD, or chemical looping. They not need an actual capture system to be integrated in with it, but what these systems do is they allow for energy generation in a different way, where we can get pure forms of CO2 on the back end of the process. We are looking at natural gas combined cycle, but it's not necessarily part of the program at this point. We have considered how we could adapt some of our capture technologies to NGCC, because there are projections out there that if we do by 2050, if we want to get to the levels that we need to reduce emissions, in the future it might be necessary to have opportunities to capture CO2 from NGCC, or even there may be a business case that capture technologies should be applied to NGCC for enhanced oil recovery. We approach our R&D investment. Well, we go all the way from, I would say, from very basic research all the way to supporting the commercial deployment. So what we look at is in basically three stages: technology development, where we're looking at the basic science, materials development, process development, bench scale, laboratory type of systems, all the way in graduating those systems, what we were getting them ready for commercial readiness, and actually deploying those through demonstration programs. And those are programs that we have within FE, which include Clean Coal Power Initiative, Industrial CCS, FutureGen 2.0, and then finally getting those technologies that graduate from commercial demonstrations into market and supporting those through either tax credits or loan guarantees. So specifically in the fossil energy program, we're really focused on applied R&D, anywhere between TRLs 2 through 7. That includes, developing novel materials, novel processes, technologies tested at the bench scale, kind of proof of concept. We're currently actually in an effort to scale technologies up that we've been developing over the last decade to, say, the 1 to 25 megawatt scale. So I'll talk a little bit about that later. TRL 5 to 7, and so we're getting technologies ready for commercial demonstration. And then finally, we do have a series of first-generation technologies I'll just highlight that are actually moving first-generation technologies into the field, actually capturing CO2 and they're fully integrated systems where they're transporting and injecting CO2, either in EOR fields or saline formations. The bottom part of this slide is just highlighting that 10 years ago, technologies to capture CO2 cost about $100 a ton. Now we think of an nth-of-a-kind plant using technologies that we're developing today and scaling up could capture CO2 at about $60 a ton. In the future, once we get to the point where we've demonstrated our second generation technologies, we think those technologies will reach a goal of about $40 a ton. So I'll highlight just the first generation technologies that we're moving through commercial demonstrations. We currently have 7 projects, 4 in EOR, or 5 in EOR, 2 in saline formations, and I'll just go over a few of the specifics of those. We have, Esposito might touch on the Southern Company's Kemper facility, which is the trig gasifier facility. Hope to be in operations in 2016. It's nearly complete, but they'll be capturing over 3 million tons of CO2 a year and transporting that for EOR and storing that in those EOR fields. We have 2 other IGCC facilities which are still under negotiations. Not necessarily, they've been going forward. They've completed the feed designs, but they're looking to finalize the financing before they actually begin construction. One is Summit, Texas Clean Energy Project, and the second is the HECA project. These are a little bit different because they're really focused on poly generation, which I would say Southern is more focused primarily on power generation, but with some poly generation. But Summit and HECA is really focused on other chemicals and power generation. We have 2 projects that are in combustion demonstration project. Petronova, and I think you've probably seen, maybe some of you have seen that we just began the groundbreaking for this project. They've gone to financial close. They'll be capturing 90% of the CO2 using an amine solvent system, capturing about 1.4 million tons and injecting that into an EOR field. That project is expected to begin operations in April 2017. It's approximately 240 megawatts. That's a standalone system with its own steam generation on an existing power plant. Second project is FutureGen 2.0, which is an oxy-combustion project in Illinois. They just received their Class 6 permit. I know they're still working through some issues, but they'll begin characterization and construction very soon. So that project, again, is scheduled to begin sometime in 2017. But this would be, in the United States, the first large-scale oxy-combustion and integrated saline storage project. And then finally, we have 2 what we call industrial demonstration projects, or industrial CCS projects. One is at Air Products, which is at a refinery where they're using vacuum sorting absorption to capture over 1 million tons of CO2. And then again, selling that CO2 into the EOR market and storage of the CO2 in those. And the last one is Archer Daniels Midland. We had a successful injection project there under a previous research program where we've injected 1 million tons. They're going to increase the size of that project to inject 1 million tons a year into a new well. They just received their Class 6 permit also, and they're undergoing characterization and drilling that well and hope to be operations in March of 2015. So that gives you a sense of where we've been with our first generation technologies. What the program within FE is really focused on is developing second generation and graduating those so we can demonstrate those by 2020. We're investing about $12 million into pre-combustion technologies, about $80 million into post-combustion technologies and advanced compression as well. So the slide's a little bit of a mess, so I'm just going to start down the left side. In PowerPoint, this looks a lot nicer. Really, these are our 4 focus points for the program. The number 1 is really we need to graduate what we consider viable second-generation capture technology and scale them up to 10 to 25 megawatts. It's kind of the next scale until we can jump to the 250 megawatt commercial demonstrations. This is where R&D really, and we call it the value depth. Everybody has a value depth. This truly is, because it really needs support. These are not commercial systems. These are one-off, applications that don't have a commercial, won't be commercial viable once they're completed, but they're necessary to get the to satisfy the developers that these can be scaled up to commercial size. Second is we're going to be looking at transformational research, both looking at new power systems as well as systems for carbon capture that can significantly reduce the cost below $40 a ton. So we are looking to work with the national laboratories. We'll be issuing a solicitation this year for new ideas to significantly reduce those costs. Third real thrust is to look at intelligent research guidance. How do we, as we go forward, we have new tools, computational power, to look at how do we design a research program in the future? Where do we need to focus our research on in the power plant? How do we help graduate technologies quicker through the system and determine which technologies make most sense by maybe doing some intelligent modeling of how we're going to integrate those systems with a full-size power plant, even when they're still relatively early in the TRL levels. And then finally, the last is looking at taking advantage of things like advanced manufacturing to reduce the capital cost, reduce or develop designs for absorbers and strippers that we just couldn't do in the past. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. We have about 70 projects in the portfolio at this point. As I mentioned, in TRL2, most of these are, there's a couple of transformational technologies, but most are second-gen technologies. We really need to fill this area back up with transformational technologies. We also need to start graduating from this TRL 5 and 6, which is the 1 megawatt, to the TRL 7, which is the 10 to 25 megawatt. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future. But we are supporting a number of projects, is what I tried to mention. Just to give you an example of the type of projects and the impacts that they have, this is just one system that we're testing with Newman Systems, looking at a completely redesign of the absorber system. As you can see in this picture, the conventional absorber is very large. We can significantly reduce that footprint and size by rethinking how we design an absorber system. This may be solvent agnostic, so you could run several different solvents through it, but it can significantly reduce the capital cost and possibly the operating cost as well. Another example is we are working on advanced sorbent systems. This is a 1 megawatt system that's actually being tested at a Southern Company power plant. They actually are operational right now. I think they may have shut in just for a few days because of the cold weather here, because it's just not heat traced. But other than that, the sorbent is undergoing basically long-term testing at this point. What's nice about sorbent systems is you can avoid the water in the system, you can avoid the latent heat of water, so you can reduce your energy for regeneration of the systems. And then finally, I'll just give you one last example of a membrane system at a 1 megawatt that we're testing at the National Carbon Capture Center. What's nice about membranes is, again, you're not worried about the water so much. You're worried about, basically you have an energy penalty by you have to operate at a differential pressure across the membrane to pull across that membrane. So these look very promising. There are some opportunities for integration with the plant that we're also going to be testing, but this actual system will be coming online in the next month again for long-term testing before we look for an opportunity for full system integration. To highlight the National Carbon Capture Center, Richard may talk a little bit about this, I'm not sure, but we do have a contract with Southern Company. It's basically a facility where we can take technologies down to maybe 6 to 7 to a dozen technologies at a time and test them on real flue gas, both from a gasification facility and a post-combustion capture facility. This facility is essentially booked for the next 2 years. We have so many technologies that we need to get down to both of these facilities. Right now we're just kind of in a juggling act to make sure that we prioritize those technologies correctly. So this is just a resource for our program and many of our developers that are developing new technologies. I wanted to highlight that we plan to come out with 2 funding opportunity announcements. This first one is looking at large-scale CO2 projects, scaling up to these 10 megawatts. We think that we need 5 projects to be successful by 2020, so we can select from 2 or 3 that are successful. if we can get 1 or 2 started in 2015 and 2016, we'll be moving towards that goal. And then second is the transformational technologies, looking at those technologies that I mentioned before that could significantly reduce the cost below $40 a ton. So these are just example areas: electrochemical, cryogenic, phase change solvents, but looking at funding technologies at this TRL 2 and 3. So I just give you an example of, a first gen, which is your conventional absorber, new stream, which is your second generation, and this ATK system, which this may or may not be a third generation, but it gives you an example. We're significantly trying to drive down the cost, either capital cost or operating costs, to reduce the overall cost of CCS. And I mentioned the carbon capture simulation initiative. This is an initiative to basically be able to take technologies and try to, prior to actually having demonstrated them, fully integrate them with a power plant to understand how you would optimize that systems integration in the power plant. And then finally, an advanced manufacturing program. This is, I think, second to last slide, but just wanted to highlight that there are areas that, we haven't really considered. Some of our technology providers are looking at, advanced roll-to-roll manufacturing, nano manufacturing to develop catalysts and membranes, or advanced coatings. But we really are starting to take a deep dive at, okay, where have we come in the last 10, 15, 20 years in terms of manufacturing? And are some of the things that they've been doing in the chemical industry or materials development, can we apply those to the challenges that we see in carbon capture? So can we, intelligently design the surface area at the nano or molecular scale for membranes and catalysts to help us with separation of CO2 from flue gas? And so this just gives you an example of some of the areas that we're starting to look at. And I think there are some significant opportunities to help reduce cost, both operational costs and capital costs of these systems. I just want to close with, we really think in DOE that, technology can help lead and inform policy, but we really need to take the opportunity to develop technologies so that there are solutions both for, policy or regulatory developers to say, yes, we can meet the standards that we need to develop to be able to mitigate climate change. We need to deploy these large projects. We're going to learn a lot just by operating these large systems. We hope that they meet our goals, but if they don't meet our goals, there's a lot of cost reductions that can be realized by just learning by doing. We realize we need to push the second generation technology envelope, so we will be doing that. And finally, we can't do this alone. We have a number of bilateral agreements with countries in China, Norway, Canada, Mexico, and others, all looking at helping to develop technologies and ways to partner with us and them so that we can reduce the cost and the overall investments that we all need to put into these technologies. I think I'll close there. I think that's my last slide. And, hold questions. I'll just turn this over to the next presenter. Thank you.
Thanks, John, for that presentation. It was really informative and really good. I would like to pass on to our next speaker, Richard Esposito from Southern Company, and hopefully he managed this technical issue. If anything, give us a minute. Richard, if you could introduce yourself and tell us what you do.
Hearing me okay now? Okay, I'm assuming that we're good. My name's Richard Esposito, and
I hear you, Richard.
Yeah, good. I work for Southern Company in our Research and Environmental Affairs group, and we have a technology development group that resides in that organization, and I'm one of the many people who work. I wanted to first kind of just introduce Southern Company a little bit. We're a large electrical utility that operates in the Southeast, and historically we've been very heavily reliant on coal as a fuel source, but over the past 10 years, we now actually last year ended up using gas more than we did for coal for our generation portfolio. But we still have a lot of coal plants, and really very interested in the issue of CCUS for those coal plants, but also keeping a balanced fuel portfolio for those plants. but you can see our operating area here. So I guess the first thing everyone probably would like to just kind of understand is that from a large electrical utility that is heavily reliant on fossil fuels, our technology drivers internally are obviously environmental regulations for, new fossil fuel plants as well as existing have in operation. And for the existing plants, those plants are, they're for the most part depreciated fossil fuel generation assets. Depreciated fossil fuel generation assets with, although we do have a lot of updated environmental controls on those plants. And then, of course, there's abundant, coal resources in the United States with stable pricing, existing infrastructure to transport. And then again, like I said, we really want to try to maintain a diverse fuel portfolio for these plants. And then in the Southeast, interestingly enough, we have a very good carbon sequestration geology. We've spent some time and worked with the Department of Energy and others to define that portfolio, as well as a strong demand for CO2 EOR. So there is, lots of opportunities for doing things with the CO2 that we would capture from these power plants. Lucas, I'm having trouble moving forward with the slides from this point.
Okay, Richard, which slide?
Okay. So in our CCUS program, we have pilot scale projects and we have demonstration scale projects. For storage, we actually started off at one of our plants in Mississippi where we trucked in 3,000 tons of CO2, injected it into the subsurface, kind of went from there to develop a project over in Alabama, in South Alabama, where we're actually capturing currently carbon dioxide from a coal-fired power plant and transporting it and injecting it into the ground. But all along with this, we're very interested in also laboratory testing and applied science. So even through this development curve of CCUS technologies, we're always interested in the basic sciences and applied science in those projects. All of that builds a foundation for commercial demonstration. So the Plant Berry project is probably one of our really interesting projects that's going on right now, because it's actually integrated where we have carbon capture on the power plant. We have about a 12-mile pipeline that's linking the capture plant to an injection site in the citronella oil field. Although it's in the citronella oil field, the CO2 is not being used for enhanced oil recovery. It's being injected into a saline formation. And then with that, we're doing monitoring of the CO2, and there's permitting and everything that would go along with a commercial scale project, but obviously at a smaller scale. Next slide. So here's a picture of the plant, and you can see where the flue gas, it's actually slipstream 25 megawatt equivalent, about 500 tons a day, where the flue gas would come in. It would go through the absorber tower, and then where the CO2 is separated from the flue gas. You would have the solvent management area, and the compressor station is over on the right, and the CO2 would come out. It's a fit-for-purpose pipeline, only a 4-inch CO2 pipeline. Next slide. So just developing from an owner-operator of carbon capture at a coal-fired power plant, just developing technology is one thing, but to build out that technology at the plant and be able to operate it is also the importance of this technology development for commercial scale projects. So this kind of shows that we actually built out this carbon capture plant off-site, because a lot of our coal-fired power plants do not have a lot of room to do construction activities on site. And also, when we were building this plant, there was some other activities going on with construction activities. So it was a big feat to actually build this off-site, transport it in modular form onto the site, and build it at the site. And that was, an interesting process, but very good for us to understand that construction process if we deploy commercial scale units in the future, whether we build them on site or transport them on site. Next slide. So for this plant, we started capture operations in June of 2011, commissioned the compressor, commissioned the pipeline, and we started CO2 injection. There was a little time lag in there from the time we started capturing CO2 to the time we injected, and that was kind of representative of a permitting period for the Class 5 permit. This wasn't a Class 6 UIC permit. It wasn't quite as robust. We did do a Class 5 through the state of Alabama. But the important thing here is that we've had a lot of operational time with this project. We've captured to date about 212,000 tons of CO2. We've injected about 113,000 tons. The unit is sized for 25 megawatt, which is around 500 tons per day. Removal efficiency has been right around 90%, and the CO2 purity has been very, very good. I would classify it as being 99.9% pure CO2. And then, of course, one of the important things that we're studying on this project, amongst others, is the steam consumption. So that's basically the parasitic load that this plant would have, the amount of electricity it would take to run the operations. And it's about a 0.9 steam consumption right now, which equates to right around 20% parasitic load. So that's pretty good. John threw out some statistics before of, how we're trying to get the costs per ton down on CO2 ultimately, and getting down to a 20% parasitic load on the capture unit is very good, and with that we could get that parasitic load down even more. The technology is actually licensed by Mitsubishi Heavy Industry. It's an advanced amine solvent, KS1 solvent that they have, and that's been they've been on the site working with us on this project. Next slide. So again, just developing the technology is one thing, but having a lot of operational experience and real world operational experience with dispatch, because you have to imagine at a coal-fired power plant, we've got this capture unit at the plant. The coal plant may go down because of a lack of dispatch on days when the electricity is not needed, but also you might have forced and also planned outages at the host unit, the coal plant. So understanding how that impacts the operations at the capture plant, but also understanding that in the injection operations and the pipeline operations, you may have issues that might crop up with the pipeline or the injection operations, which would require the capture plant to not dispatch. So understanding how to shut this thing down, start it up, and operate it under those realistic operating conditions, and ramping it up, kind of following the power load as the power plant is dispatching more, ramping this capture unit up and kind of mimicking that capture load. Lots of process improvements, again, the reduction of parasitic load, and that equates obviously to reductions in the overall cost of electricity for the project. One other thing I'll mention here is we're awarded some money from the Department of Energy to do an HES study, which is a high efficiency study, which is, what we're looking at there is trying to recover some of the waste heat from the capture unit and integrating that back into the power plant. So at this point, if the HES study, which is supposed to start up this month or possibly next month, if we could even reduce that parasitic load 1 or 2% with heat recovery, then that's really huge for us on the overall cost of electricity. Next slide. So also, as electric utility, we deal with transmission lines, and that's good. We do that very well, but we don't know a whole lot about pipelines, although we are getting into natural gas pipelines a little bit, but CO2 pipelines we don't have a lot of experience with. So it was a very interesting process to link to the injection site. And you can see some pictures here. We did a lot of incline drilling, which is under roads, and actually did that under sensitive habitat and ecosystems, such as habitat for the gopher tortoise, which we have in the southeast, and also with wetlands. So that worked out very well. But if you look at the bottom right picture, it's interesting. What we did on this project is we actually used the existing transmission right-of-way as a construction easement for this pipeline, and was able to save quite a bit of costs on doing that. So that's a model that we would look at in modeling out infrastructure from sources to sinks in the future for commercial scale carbon capture and storage, is looking at existing right-of-ways, because they're easier to build out than going into greenfield sites. Next slide. So the storage project was very informative for us. Also, the part of this project, we did underground injection control permitting. Denbury actually holds the Class 5 permit. Lots of site characterization. We had very successful outreach and education. Of course, this was in an oil field environment, so the people were used to drilling and injection operations and extraction operations. Doing a lot of work with monitoring, verification, and accounting. Advanced Resources International and Denbury is doing a lot of that work. Modeling, predicting, where the injected CO2 is going to go to, monitoring it, and then go back and recalibrate those models and understand how accurately we can get those models to simulate exactly what's going to happen in the subsurface based on site characterization information. And then, of course, the pipeline construction and operating that pipeline is very important, and integrating that pipeline with the capture plant. Now, the injection formation is the Paluxy Formation, which is Cretaceous in age, and we picked a really good formation. Like I said, in the southeast, we have some sequestration formations, some saline formations that have very high porosity and permeability, which we really don't have an issue with getting relatively large volumes of CO2 into the ground with fewer wells than many others of the country might have to have. Next slide. So we've done a fair amount of geological characterization. So obviously, as a company, we'd like to know underneath each one of our power plants, what's the potential for doing, geological storage, as well as understanding the local oil fields and if they're miscible floods, or whether the oil companies are interested in eventually EOR in those oil fields. But we did a site characterization through the Department of Energy's site characterization program in north central Alabama at one of our power plants. We did the Mississippi Power project over at Plant Daniel in South Mississippi. We've drilled the wells for the Plant Berry project that I mentioned right around the Plant Berry site, and then we're also drilling. We're looking to drill a few more wells at different power plants in next year, and again, understanding what can we do at the sites, because if you're looking at modeling out the costs of CCS, you have to understand what kind of infrastructure you're going to need. And in areas where there isn't any CO2 pipelines, you're going to have to account for that. So source sink matching is very important. There's a lot of storage capacity in many regions across the United States, and especially in the Southeast. But if that storage capacity is not next to those CO2 emitting sources, then that's could be very costly. And then all that information rolling up into the Department of Energy's Carbon Sequestration Atlas. Next slide. And John mentioned the carbon capture, the National Carbon Capture Center. I won't talk about that too much, but it's a facility that's just south of Birmingham, Alabama, that is a neutral test facility for technologies. At Southern Company, we're technology agnostic on what works and what's the lowest cost option. And so that the Department of Energy funds and Southern Company operates, that any people who have innovative ideas for capturing carbon could come to this facility and test their capture technology. Next slide. And again, the role of the National Carbon Capture Center, like John laid out, was to kind of get through that technology valley of death. It's easy to do things at a lab scale, but when you want to validate that at a small pilot or a large pilot scale, it gets expensive, and you need a facility where you have access to flue gas or syn fuel to do that. And the National Carbon Capture Center is that premier facility in the United States. Next slide. So on commercialization, you know, on capture, we still have, you know, we need advanced processes, new chemistries, and be able to scale up technologies. You know, we really, at the rate that we need to deploy this technology to be meaningful for climate change, we plan to take every technology from the pilot to the, you know, small demonstration to the commercial scale. So we have to be able to understand how to take technologies that are maybe at the large pilot or small demo and scale them up to a commercial scale. And that's kind of, in some respects, that's a leap of faith, and it involves some risk. But you know, if you manage that risk properly, it could pay off for you. Reducing station service, the parasitic load, and the capital costs of construction. I mean, those will come down some, but they're, you know, not as much as maybe the station service could. For scenario planning, again, you know, system analysis of infrastructure using existing right-of-ways, you know, trying to do anything we can to reduce costs, you know, for deploying these technologies commercially. For storage, I think we can do a pretty good job of site characterization, and monitoring probably still needs a little more work, but I think we're making good progress. Simulating the injection, permitting, you know, there's a few Class 6 wells that have been permitted recently, and I think those experiences are going to be very helpful. And then CO2 EOR being storage, I think that's really just finding a path forward that makes sense for CO2 that's used in EOR operations to be considered stored. And then public acceptance, I think, is going to vary from region to region. Some locations may be an obstacle, in others I think that it won't be as tough as others. Next slide. So one thing, I'm just about done, but one thing that we have evolved in is our thinking of liability. So, you know, 7 years ago we had, our thoughts were that, you know, the risks related to the environmental damages of CCS, geological storage, you know, were probably, you know, potentially high. But we did some studies. We commissioned industrial economics to do some valuation of CCS damages. And the first study that we did was we actually worked with the information from the non-funded FutureGen sites, used the EIS data, and they developed a Monte Carlo model, and we developed a risk registry. We evaluated the probability of those risks and then valued those risks, and spent a lot of time really thinking about this from a very advanced thinking process to develop, you know, what these risks would be. So we did that, and then we did a phase 2 of that where we actually went to, so that was just for sites that were not having any injection operations, that were really not active sites. So we decided to model the Plant Berry project. So we went in and had DNV and others, the Southern States Energy Board, help us develop a risk registry for that project and model that. And then based on that, we went ahead and scaled that up to a commercial scale project at the Plant Berry site to understand the difference between the risks that we were modeling on that experimental project, you know, the 500 tons today, compared to a 3,000 ton, a million ton a year project. And there's actually a manuscript that was just at a GHGT that you could look, application of risk-based probability model to value potential risks if you're interested in some of the results. Next slide. So this is 7 to 10 years ago. This was sort of our tranches of liability that we thought we might need to have for CCS, commercial scale CCS, and you can see it's in the 50 million per occurrence and 900 million for life of the facility. Kind of some pretty big numbers. You go to the next slide. What we have gotten as a result of our modeling is that you can see that, you know, the 50 percentile damages for both the experimental and the commercial scale project are far less than $20 million. And even if you move that up to 90 percentile damages, you have very, you know, you don't have damages that are nearly as high as what we anticipated. And a lot of our thoughts before were because we really didn't have any studies like this to understand the potential damages. Next slide. So in conclusions, I think that CCS, I think it'll be a niche market resulting from siting attributes. Again, long distance pipeline transport are probably going to put the costs over the top on deploying this technology. It's going to be driven by utilities and people wanting fuel diversity, as well as having stable long-term fuel costs. Where we have a lot of natural gas power right now in our system, and we're very pro natural gas. But it's good to have a diversity in that fuel. I think that having revenue from EOR will be very important to building new facilities, especially the early ones out, because then you're offsetting the cost of sequestration with revenue coming in. And then non-traditional business models, I think, for the utilities, how vertically integrated do we want to be with managing capture, transportation, and storage, or do we just sell at the gate, or do we, like some other projects, have ownership in some of the oil fields and get revenue from royalties? CO2 EOR needs to be considered as storage. I think that's going to be a very important issue. And then again, financial factors will need to be closely evaluated, federal and state incentives, CO2 revenue, and other byproducts. So like at the Kemper plant, we've got other byproducts other than CO2 that we're selling into the market, like anhydrous ammonia and uric acid. And then again, more demonstration facilities, scale facilities are needed, and we need to keep pushing the envelope on R&D to continue to reduce the overall costs and ensure operational reliability. And with that, I'll just turn it back over, and I think Mary Rose is next on the list.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Richard, for your informative presentation. I'll pass it on to Molly now. If you could just introduce yourself and tell us what you do, Molly.
Sure. Thank you. So I wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to present today. And just to give a little bit of background on the focus of my presentation, John and Richard have done a really nice job in giving a much broader perspective, particularly with respect to the capture technology and the capture side. And so in discussing with Lucas in setting up this particular presentation, I had confirmed that my emphasis would be on the underground component, so the storage component. And in order, if were we to be in a room together, I might ask for a show of hands for folks that are familiar with the underground injection control program. But in the absence of that, the way that I've structured my presentation is to give a brief overview of the UIC program, just to make sure that we're sort of on a level playing field. And then to focus on a discussion of the Class 6 carbon dioxide GS, or geologic sequestration rule, both the development and implementation, including permitting, and then to talk a little bit about stakeholder coordination. So for frame of reference, the Underground Injection Control Program is a program within the EPA that has promulgated regulations to ensure protection of underground sources of drinking water. So that's sort of the term that we use. It typically is waters of less than 10,000 parts per million total dissolved solids, and we have our authority under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So our emphasis really is safe and secure storage that ensures protection of drinking water. I won't be talking about the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program regulations or other air regulations, nor will I be focusing on the RCRA conditional exclusion, which some of you might be familiar with. Those are separate programs outside of the Underground Injection Control Program's purview. So again, just to provide some context, there are now, as of 2010, 6 well classes within the UIC program. Class 1 wells are typically used for industrial and municipal as well as hazardous waste injection. Class 2 wells are used for injection of fluids associated with oil and gas activities. That could be disposal of fluids, enhanced recovery, which both John and Richard have mentioned, as well as some hydrocarbon storage. Class 3 wells are used for solution mining. Class 4 wells are a well category that's been banned since the development of the program in the 1980s. However, they are used in unique circumstances associated with RCRA and CERCLA cleanup sites. Class 5 wells are a catch-all category that has been historically used where a well does not fall into any of the other classes that I just mentioned. These tend to be shallow, but they're not exclusively shallow or injection wells. And then Class 6 wells, which are the well class that I'm going to focus on for the balance of my presentation. And before moving on, just given that I haven't provided any other opportunities in other slides to mention this, I do want to mention something that both John and Richard have brought up, which is that EPA does recognize, and even within the UIC program, the storage of CO2 at EOR sites. However, whether or not geologic sequestration is occurring, whether or not that storage is considered geologic sequestration, is not really the focus of the UIC program. What we're interested in, regardless of well class, is ensuring that underground sources of drinking water are protected. So it's a slight nuance, but it's important maybe so that the participants understand why I'm focusing on Class 6. So again, just to give a little bit of context, all of the requirements in all of the well classes focus on the foundation of the UIC program, which is to ensure that there are or that the pathways for potential fluid migration have been evaluated and mitigated to the best of an owner-operator's abilities. And this diagram is really just to depict whether it be faulty injection well casing or other artificial penetrations in the project area, migration of fluids through faults or fractures, or injection directly into an underground source of drinking water, which is obviously a risk that would be important to mitigate within our program. So to shift the focus back to geologic sequestration, we were tasked, and I'll talk a little bit on the next slide about the time frame, we were tasked with developing or preparing regulations or regulatory framework that could be used in the eventuality that CCS technologies are deployed on a larger scale. So back in 2007, the agency started to look at the existing regulatory framework from the well classes for class 1 through 5 to see where it would be most appropriate to fit CO2 injection for long-term storage. And the conclusion was drawn that it was most appropriate to develop a new well class using the existing regulatory framework. The considerations that the agency, in coordination with stakeholders, including Department of Energy, the Department of Interior, and others, were to look at the larger volumes expected in comparison to other well classes, the behavior of the CO2 in the subsurface, and the potential corrosivity in the presence of water. So on the right-hand side of this slide are the program elements that are typical, the majority are typical of other well classes, with a few augmentations for Class 6 for geologic sequestration. And I wanted to take this opportunity on this slide to mention that there are a few issues that we don't address due to the focus of our statute, the Safe Drinking Water Act. We don't address pore space ownership, mineral rights, surface infrastructure, such as pipelines, which are typically regulated through the Department of Transportation. Because Richard mentioned it, I should also mention that long-term liability beyond the operational life of the UIC injection well is also not addressed within our purview. So as I mentioned, this is just a brief timeline of when the Class 6 rule was developed in comparison to all of the other well classes, which had regulations on the books starting in the 1980s. We were asked to start developing regulations in 2007 to anticipate deployment of the technology and finalize those regulations in 2010. with several interim publications to seek comment and notice additional data for comment. I want to mention also that within the UIC program, it's a voluntary activity to inject. Within our program, we don't mandate injection. So should an owner-operator choose to come in and apply to inject, we would work with them to comply with the requirements, but we're not going out and knocking on doors to get compliance. And as I mentioned previously, we have coordinated historically, and we continue to coordinate closely with other EPA offices, including the RCRA office and the Office of Air and Radiation, as well as working with federal partners, including the IRS, states, and stakeholders. So following finalization of the requirements in 2010, we had a significant workload in front of us to ensure consistent implementation. We did a series of workshops in the first year, 2011, following the promulgation of the regulations. We've developed a series of technical guidance documents, some of which are listed here. Really, for each program element, we developed a technical document that expanded upon the information and the requirements. So the requirements being the law, the guidance simply being that, guidance to enhance one's understanding both on the part of the owner-operator and the permitting authority of the intent of the requirements, and recommendations on ways that one might meet the requirements. And so again, just for the injection component. We also finalized a guidance for financial responsibility, and we finalized a document or a set of documents to support states that might want to implement the Class 6 program at the state level. So I'm a federal government employee and represent the perspective of the U.S. EPA. So we've promulgated federal regulations that states can actually pick up and implement themselves. EPA directly implements the program, the Class 6 program, nationally because no states yet have primary enforcement responsibility to implement the program. We also have been engaged actively in permitting. John has mentioned a few projects. Richard mentioned some, and I'll go through them from a slightly different perspective just to talk about the geology and the permitting process a little bit. And we continue to engage in stakeholder coordination. So the first project that I'll mention, and John had mentioned this before, is in Decatur, Illinois with the Archer Daniels Midland company. The injection is into the Mount Simon. The confining zone is the Eau Claire Formation. And there are 2 injection wells associated with this project with 2 separate permits. One is a final permit, which was just recently appealed, and we're working through that process. It's appealed to the Environmental Appeals Board. The second is in a draft form, and we're working on the responses to comments on that permit, and we should be issuing a final permit in the coming months. And just just west of the Decatur project is the Future Gen Alliance project in Jacksonville, Illinois, with the same injection zone and confining zone. This is a longer-term operation. As you'll see, it's between the injection phase and the post-injection phase. It's approximately 70 years. And there are 4 permits associated with this project. Those were issued several months ago. They were also appealed, and we're working through that appeal process with the expectation of moving towards final decisions in the coming year. And just to differentiate between the previous 2 projects for which we have made permit decisions, we're also evaluating the permit application for the Brexco company in Wellington, Kansas, and they're proposing a smaller scale injection that would also be categorized as Class 6. And we're working on evaluating that permit application, which was received by the agency in June of this year. And we anticipate that one of the other Department of Energy Regional Carbon Sequestration Partnerships, the Big Sky Partnership, will be submitting a permit application at some point in the, we're debating whether it'll be later this year, which is quickly diminishing, or early in 2015. And as I previously have mentioned or highlighted, some of our stakeholder coordination throughout the regulatory development process as well as through implementation, we continue to work closely with our federal partners as well as state partners, in as much as there are a number of states that may wish to seek primacy to directly to implement the program at the state level. We work closely with several state organizations, so the Groundwater Protection Council and the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission, and take every opportunity to meet via webinar or at meetings with other interested stakeholders to share information about geologic sequestration, the injection component, and hear from stakeholders. So with that, I want to thank you.
Thanks, Molly, for your presentation. I have a few questions that have been submitted that I would like to raise. The first question will be coming up from Bill McPherson from DTE Energy Services, and his is removal of NOx, AR, VOCs, and other impurities in the CO2 stream necessary prior to sequestration.
This is John Litynski. I would say that thinking about the storage side, but from the capture side, some of the impurities like NOx and SOx and others might cause a problem with some of the chemicals or the capture equipment that we would actually be capturing. So like an amine system, SO2 would definitely have negative impacts on the capture system. That doesn't preclude that some advanced technology could capture CO2 and those trace contaminants and pass them through the capture system, but it may have also impacts on the pipeline, on the compression system. But I'll kind of pass the question to Molly and Richard if they want to address any issues with storage of those contaminants.
Yeah, this is Richard. I agree with John. Capture standpoint, like with our Plant Berry project, the unit that we're pulling that flue gas off is scrubbed for NOx and SOx, and if we didn't, it would interfere with our solvents, and then also compression would be tougher. And then I'd be concerned with if that would affect two-phase flow or issues with pipeline transport as well. And I'll let Molly kind of take it from here on the storage.
Okay, thanks. So with respect to the UIC regulations, we wrote the regulations for a carbon dioxide stream plus, and this is from the regulatory language, incidental associated substances. So as it relates to Class 6, there is potentially a way to accommodate that via Class 6. However, if it were not, if there were any questions, we could work through those with a particular generator, given that what John and Richard have mentioned, that it's highly likely that those issues would be resolved before it would get to the injection site. But there are opportunities to address that. Additionally, or just to complement the definition of the carbon dioxide stream, there's a requirement to characterize the constituents and the composition of the CO2 stream prior to injection. So that certainly would be a consideration during the permitting process.
Okay, thank you. And our second question comes up from Ashby Scott from Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, and he was wondering, given that carbon capture and storage for geological long-term storage is currently only viable in specific geologies, will the technology shift towards reacting CO2 with metal oxides to form carbonates for utility boilers, which are not located in the area with suitable geology for long-term storage?
This is John Litynski. I'll start with that one also. We actually had a program about 10 years ago, it concluded a while ago, on looking at carbonate reactive to geologic deep injection of CO2 in geologic formations. And the problem with that approach is that it's very expensive and very energy intensive. And so, compared to actually building a pipeline several hundred miles and injecting in a saline formation that may be several hundred miles away, that was actually a better alternative than reacting with carbonates. So from right now, we're always looking for opportunities to use the CO2 in other ways and convert it to other forms or other products. And so we do have some activities in that area. So yes, there are some power plants that are several hundred miles from sinks, and we're always looking for CO2 use and reuse applications or other alternatives to geologic storage. But carbonate, reacting with carbonates is definitely has serious challenges at this point.
Yeah, this is Richard, and I really don't have a whole lot to add beyond what John said. A lot of the technologies that we're looking at directly and scaling up, to larger pilots and demonstration does not involve technology. So we're looking at more of the traditional solvents and solid sorbent technologies.
Okay. I have one more, another question coming up from Kevin Connors from Mali. He's from our Department of Mineral Resources. Can you please describe what involvement the state of Illinois had during Class 6 permitting process?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Could you describe what involvement the state of Illinois had during Class 6 permitting process?
Okay. So this actually it was specific to different projects. So we had, as I mentioned, the FutureGen project and the ADM project. So on the FutureGen project, we consulted, as the regulatory authority for Class 6, we consulted with the state of Illinois in working through the permit application evaluation. There's actually a requirement in the regulations to consult with any states that might, whether it be one or multiple states in the jurisdiction of the area of review. Additionally, we worked with several folks from the Illinois Geological Survey to get feedback on portions of the permit application, given their expertise in that particular part of the country. And on the issue of the Archer-Daniels-Midland project, because there were two permits, the first having been issued by the Illinois EPA prior to finalization of the requirements, the Class 6 requirements in 2010, they actually issued a permit and are the authority, the regulatory authority for CCUS number 1. We issued, and that would be the draft permit I mentioned. We just closed the public comment period on November 7th for a Class 6 permit that will replace the existing Class 1 permit that Illinois EPA issued. And on the second well at the ADM project, again, we consulted with Illinois EPA and in compliance with our requirements and leveraged some of their expertise and the knowledge of the geology in that particular area.
Thank you, Mary. I have a question for Richard. Richard, can you answer the question by Karen Obenshane from the Edison Electric Institute, just down below in the box?
Okay. Okay, so I think I'll reiterate the question. It relates to the site characterization 6 related to the Class 5 that we did. And really, there was no difference in that. In fact, the Class 5 permit that was issued for that injection was very similar to the requirements of a Class 6 permit, other than the financial assurance and the long-term closure requirements. So all the things that we had to do to go out to demonstrate the integrity of the storage site were were parallel to what would be theoretically done in a Class 6 permit.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Could you also go ahead and answer the question by Mohammed Mereb about the market for capture of CO2?
Yeah, so I see that. So yeah, it's a primarily right now, especially in the southeast, there's a lot of enhanced oil recovery operations going on, particularly with oil companies such as Denbury Resources and Tellus Energy in Mississippi. And so the CO2 that is to be captured from the Kemper Energy facility over in Mississippi will be sold to several different oil companies for enhanced oil recovery. And for the scale of the amount of CO2 that we would be required to capture from our facilities, the megaton a year volumes, we would really need to, enhanced oil recovery is really the only option that we're very guardedly optimistic that will work for those volumes. For smaller facilities or industrial sources, of course, there's other potential use and reuse options.
Okay. Thanks, Richard, for that. I would like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. Special thanks goes out again to our speakers that made this eConference wonderful. Special thanks to Richard Esposito, Mary Rose Bayer, and John Litynski. I'll be sending out their poll feedback form, and if you guys could fill it in, that would be really much appreciated. It would just pop up in your window. All the presentations will also be available, and the eConference will be also available to watch on demand within 48 hours of the meeting. Once more, thank you everyone for attending. Special thanks to the speakers once more, and I hope we'll see you soon at our next upcoming carbon capture and storage eConferences. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.